Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Patty Baldwin, and I'm the Assistant Director here at the Guilford Free Library. And I'm sorry about this echo. First, let me tell you a little bit about David Little, who is an artist. He has had solo and group exhibits throughout Maine and has just published The Art of Katahdin, The Mountain, the Range, and the Region, which was named a Best of New England book in 2013 by the Boston Globe, and we have copies up in front for sale. He's recently co-curated an exhibition, A Mountain Rises, The Art of Katahdin, at the University of New England Art Gallery in Portland, and an exhibition on the book, The Art of Katahdin, The Making of an Art Book. And he has samples from that here for you to look at. In the back of the room, we have some of Charles Hubbard's paintings and some pages from his manuscript that, when he died, came to the library. It was a very large collection of material, and it wasn't until David arrived and made us take out every single box of everything that had been carefully labeled to put together the sketches, the paintings, and the manuscript. The day that he first arrived, he spent about 3 hours with us, and when I took Edith home that evening, she said, "How about a drink?" So, let me have you welcome David Little. Thank you.
Turn down the lights, please. Oh, Patty's going to do it. Okay. Is that okay for people in the back, or would you rather? Yeah, turn those off. Thanks, Patty, for that great introduction. Can everyone hear me? Because I'm all mic'd up, so I want to make sure that I'm broadcasting. Patty was really the one who's helped me get set up to do the research here, so I'm very grateful for that. Also, the late Edith Nettleton was wonderful to work with. I think I worked with her either once or twice up in the historical room at the library. If you have a cell phone and you're able to turn it off, that's a good time to do it. I did shut mine off, but I forgot to mention it. I also wanted to thank Carl Balistraci and Joel Helander for their assistance in gathering materials for the book. And finally, I have just thanks that are more distant. Deborah Staber, who none of you probably are familiar with, she's the director of the L.C. Bates Museum at the Goodwill School in Fairfield, Maine. And she helped me in the last 2 weeks with some of the visuals, some of the diorama pieces that Hubbard painted, which there are many of them, and I had to be very selective because I wanted to focus on his Katahdin work. And then finally, Bill Bentley and Svet Kirchev, I'd like to mention them. They are my tech helpers in Maine. So they do the formatting, scanning, and in this case, the sequencing of the visuals I'm very challenged with a computer, so I get help where I can get it. Last year was a big year for Katahdin and the arts in Maine. The book Art of Katahdin was published in May after 7 years of research and development. It sold out in November and was named one of the best of 2013 books about New England by the Boston Globe's Jan Gardner. I was delighted by that. An exhibition that helped launch the book was held at the University of New England Art Gallery in Portland, beginning in August, and went on to set attendance records. For that exhibition, the Guilford Free Library loaned 2 of the master sheets from Hubbard's last book, Camping in the New England Mountains. During the course of research for the book, I traveled to Guilford on 3 occasions, each time to examine his work in depth and formulate ideas for the chapter that I would write about his trips to Katahdin. My first visit was in October 2008, the second in May of 2010, and the final visit, I brought along a professional photographer, was in December of 2011. And as Patty said, we had trouble taking really professional photographs with the fluorescent lighting, so we had to put some of those works under the tables up there and photograph them sort of in a different way where you're kind of stooped over it. And one in particular, we had to get right down on the floor to photograph it because it's just a small detail. There were two earlier exhibitions in Maine, both at the L.C. Bates Museum in Fairfield, Maine, that either highlighted Hubbard's work or included his work. Because of Hubbard's long association with the Goodwill School, the museum there was a natural fit for these exhibits. The first was in 1996 and was a retrospective of the paintings, writings, and drawings of Hubbard. The 40-page catalog written by Marius Pellido, former director of the Farnsworth Museum and author and historian, is indeed impressive. For the Hubbard chapter in my book, his research and biographical essay on Charles Hubbard were seminal. The second exhibition, titled Looking at Katahdin, The Artist Inspiration, was held in 1999. This exhibition included a Hubbard painting titled Haze on the Mountain, borrowed from the Guilford Free Library. Since one of my own paintings was included in this exhibit, I attended the opening and became aware of Charles Daniel Hubbard for the first time. And finally, I'll mention a leaflet that was published in 1946 of 52 pages of sketches and commentaries Hubbard made of those spots of interest at Goodwill that he thought significant to the school's development and his role in it. And among those were the Roosevelt Tablet, the Granite House, the entrance to the Dartmouth Trail, and even Camp Flapjack. I hope after the talk you'll get a chance to see Hubbard's painting, and you'll see tonight the pen and ink drawing that was done from this painting. My talk today is designed around the idea of setting the Connecticut artist Charles Hubbard in Maine, with an emphasis on his work in the Katahdin region. I hope to do this with some visual materials from the book, Art of Katahdin, that set the stage, and then mix in works of Hubbard's contemporaries as well as works by modern, present-day artists for comparison and balance. So let's start. The earliest peoples to experience the Katahdin region were the Native American Indians from the four tribes of the Abenaki, the Penobscots, Passamaquoddies, Maliseets, and Micmacs. For the first peoples, Katahdin is the dwelling place of the Great Spirit, a sacred place. Some of these Indians became expert guides for early scientific expeditions, as well as for artists like Frederick Church and vacationists like Thoreau. Titian Ramsey Peale, a Philadelphia artist, happened to be in the Katahdin region as early as 1830, collecting butterflies and moths, when this scene captured his attention and watercolor brush. In this simplified state map, Katahdin and Baxter State Park are located in the north central part of the state, the park being dark green and consisting of over 220,000 acres of land. And before I continue, you can see the, down at the bottom in the middle there, you can see the Kennebec River going up to Moosehead Lake off of Route 95. If you go up and turn off the exit right there, the Goodwill home where Charles lived and worked in the summers is very close to Route 95. It's within a 15-minute drive. The aerial photograph, taken in 1945, gives a sense of the massive size of Katahdin and the area over which the artist Charles Hubbard hiked, camped, and sketched. I might add that back at the time that he came up to Maine, there was no Route 95. Myron Avery, the driving force behind the creation of the Appalachian Trail in Maine, he once wrote, "From each cardinal direction, Katahdin's aspect is utterly different, noting that it is not one, but many mountains. Counterclockwise from the top left, a traveler sees the shifting silhouettes of Katahdin. These differing shapes underscore the exciting challenges and allure for the artist. Hubbard, as we shall see, chose to get closer in to his subject and was one of the very few, starting with Frederick Church, to have painted on the flanks and ridges of the mountain. And one note, the middle postcard on the left is of Katahdin Stream Campground, which is where Hubbard camped on the southwest side of the mountain. It's the beginning of the hunt trail, and I think that when this photograph was taken, it's a little bit further along. He was there in the 30s, and this postcard is probably from the 50s, but not much has changed. There were still sites that had been built by the CCC. The arrows on this map detail show where artists worked at Katahdin, setting up easels, taking photographs, writing journals. You can see, if you look at Charles Hubbard up there on the left and Chris Polson down below, the two of them are among the very few that have climbed up onto the mountain with their gear to work. In this talk, we will see 9 of these artists, briefly, except for Hubbard. Much like the postcards and illustrations of Katahdin, these paintings advertise adventure, tranquility, and scenic splendor of the wilderness area around the time of Hubbard's birth in 1876. At top left is a painting by Virgil Williams from 1870 titled "The View of Katahdin from the West Branch of the Penobscot River" from the Lunder collection at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. At bottom right is a painting by Frederick Church titled "View of Mount Katahdin" from 1878 in the collection of David Rockefeller Sr. Church painted it in his New York studio from sketches he made the previous September when he was at Katahdin Lake. Hubbard himself was born in July of 1876, the same year as Percival Baxter, the philanthropist that purchased all the lands that today form Baxter State Park. At the time of Hubbard's 5 trips to Katahdin in 1935, 38, 39, 40, and 41, the park itself was very much in its infancy. With this very brief setting, and there is much more in my book, we fast forward to Charles Hubbard in Maine. Hubbard's connection to Maine came from his association with the Reverend George W. Hinckley, a fellow member of the First Congregationalist Church in Guilford, Connecticut. They shared an interest in religion, art, nature, the out of doors, and natural history, and eventually they spent summers together designing and building the Goodwill Home, a school for disadvantaged children in Fairfield, Maine. With his background in illustration, fine art, design, and teaching, Hubbard was well suited to the tasks he would undertake at the school during the summer months, beginning in 1916. Down here, bottom right, the Goodwill roundel. It doesn't look quite as round, crammed down there, it looks more oval. The Goodwill roundel from 1918 was one of the earliest designs Hubbard made for the school. It's 31 inches in diameter, probably close to that, painted in oils on academy board, and set into the wood paneling in what was the Reverend Hinckley's office. An earlier version of the roundel was designed in 1912, while Hubbard was still studying at the Art Students League in New York. It was to become the logo for the school and represented its spirit, work and recreation in the outdoors combined with a study of natural history. The pen and ink drawing is of Camp Flapjack on the eastern shore of the Kennebec River across from the school. Here, Hubbard represents his Adirondack-style lean-to with stone fireplace that the Reverend Hinckley allowed him to build in 1932. It served as his base of operations for hiking and painting trips throughout Maine and New Hampshire, along the coasts and in the mountains. A true nature lover, Hubbard is laying in an outline drawing on a warm summer day. The audience for this plein air performance may well be the Ayrshire cows given to the school back when it was indeed a farm and a school. Cows are innately curious, and were it not for the fence, would be nudging the artist to see if his painting gear was edible. I know because I've had the same experience with cows coming up and bumping me while I'm trying to paint and having to move because they're so curious. This painting of Mount Kineo is one of the 4 large murals Hubbard painted to decorate the walls of the Granite House, a building he designed. He was an architect, as well as so many other things. In 1933, at the Goodwill School, to house a varied collection of New England granite rocks from many quarries he visited that year. And take note, on July 18, 1933, Hubbard drove to Rockwood on Moosehead Lake, climbed Mount Kineo, as Thoreau had done 80 years earlier. The next day, he sketched the view from Rockwood, which may have been a model for this piece. Mount Kineo is one of the earliest natural quarries in the state, used for thousands of years by Indians seeking its rhyolite or flint stones for axes, arrows, and chisels. Hubbard would have collected samples for the Goodwill collection. And actually, George Hinckley, the Reverend Hinckley, was really the big collector. And from when he was very young, it was his passion to collect things. So when he got this idea to put together the school, he had already formed an enormous collection of items that he needed a place to put. And so that's what led to these different buildings at the Goodwill School. This is one of the slides that Deb Staber sent me. With this slide, a very small detail from large painted artist boards that were joined together, Deb writes this to me in an email. The bears are in the large diorama on the north wall of Mammal Room that Hinckley referred to as Hubbard Hall. The room had just the animals and not the wood cases early on. The diorama, painted by Hubbard, is of Pleasant Mountain and Pond in Caratunk, Maine, that is on the Appalachian Trail, one of the many places Hubbard visited for reference material. The background painting is over 31 feet long and has side walls about 9 feet long each. This is just a tiny detail of it. I've had several artists, this is her continuing, I've had several artists and museum directors say it might be the largest Maine landscape ever painted. The diorama consists of deer, caribou, bears, and some smaller animals, and once had a life-size moose. The bears were prepared by Fred Park, a well-known Bangor taxidermist. The dioramas were done in the early 20s. And note, Hubbard completed 28 bird and mammal dioramas for the school. Some of these were in the Shell House, and those are mostly seascapes that he did down at MDI. And some were in the Dendrology Museum, the Museum of Trees. Hubbard traveled over 3,000 miles to gather materials for this school and for these buildings. Objects, paintings, photographs, all reference material he would use to create these big, large paintings. And this one I mentioned was, you only have artist board that's so long, so it has to be seamed together. And a lot of these pieces are curved so that the animals can kind of snug in around them and be placed with background materials. And that must have been a thing back then, to take these large boards and figure out how to join them together seamlessly. Here's a comparison piece that's in the book. A large mural by Maine artist D. Crosby Brown titled The Katahdin River Drive, finished in 1982. It was commissioned for the McDonald's restaurant in Lincoln and measures 4 by 10 feet. The depiction of the Spring River Drive on the west branch of the Penobscot River would certainly have been an appropriate historical subject for the Goodwill students. Another quarry subject that was displayed in the Granite House. This is one of the Black Diamond Granite Quarry in Addison, Maine, up along the down east coast. Note the two-masted schooner tucked behind one of the cutting sheds that would carry the heavy blocks of granite to the big East Coast cities and elsewhere. This painting may well have been done from photos and small drawings that the artist made on site. Charles Hubbard perfected the early art of car camping, fitting out his touring car. The rear seat was changed into a bed or bunks with compartments underneath for storage. In this photo of an expedition with George Hinckley seated, you can see him there sitting at the table, a tent has been raised on the back side of the vehicle. The pen and ink drawing is from the book Camping in the New England Mountains. Hubbard writes, right there, along with this drawing, he says, "I find satisfactory my rather ancient LaSalle sedan, which I have fitted with bunks for 2 and a sort of cupboard or chuck box carried on the rear end like a trunk. In this are shelves for food and dishes. Hubbard only slept in the sedan, so he says, when an emergency arose." Now we start our move with Hubbard to Katahdin and his 5 recorded adventures in the region between 1935 and 1941. This small oil on panel, which might be in the back there, is that one of the ones that you got? It's 12 by 16 inches. So one of the things I always like to say in my talks is that the size is really, sometimes it's close, but often these are, because of the big screen, it really does make them look much larger than they are. A lot of them are very intimate, particularly the pen and ink drawings. The small oil on panel of Pomola, I can actually point to it from here. This is Pomola right here, Pomola Peak, and then this is the chimney coming down, the trail called the Chimney, which is the most difficult trail in Katahdin, and this is Chimney Peak. This is a typical Hubbard palette knife plein air work. By working small, Hubbard could easily transport his wet panels inside a slotted paint box as he hiked some of the steeper trails of Katahdin. Hubbard was well aware that sudden wind gusts up on the mountain ridges could play havoc with a large canvas. The pen and ink drawing uses this earlier oil sketch as a model. Relating memories of this experience, Hubbard wrote this: "Lingering for a season in the saddle, and again at the point where the cathedral completes its ambitious course, there stood revealed new prospects towards Baxter Peak and the knife edge, its serrated outline ever mounting from Pomola upwards. It stood like the reredos behind the high altar of all New England." Here's a note. I looked up the word reredos in the dictionary, and it means an ornamental stone screen or partition wall behind the altar. It's a 14th century Middle English word. I had no idea what it meant. And I wonder if there was a reredos possibly at the First Congregational Church in Guilford. Maybe. This digital image just came to me yesterday. It was one I had hoped to get for this talk, because if you look at it, you can see the places that Hubbard went. You will see that he painted in the North Basin. He painted it right down here at Blueberry Knoll. He painted over, if you go up on here, you can see the Hunt Trail, that long dotted line going up. That's the trail he took several times to go up. He never painted at Baxter Peak, but he did paint up at the top of the saddle. And you can see also over there the cathedral, that dotted line going up there is the cathedral trail. He painted on one of the cathedrals, we think. So he was all over this mountain on these trips. He would basically go up one way, go across, and come down another way. And then sometimes when he was down at Chimney Pond, he would go down to Basin Ponds, which you can see there, and paint there, and then go back and camp, and then go over to Blueberry Knoll. So he used Chimney Pond a fair amount for his base, as well as the campground at Katahdin Stream on the other side, which would be down in that far left-hand corner of the top slide. I just wanted to show you I'm not using a red pointer, but if you can see that, this was done from a hiker's illustrated guide published in 2007 and designed by Edward Rolfe. And I was on the phone with him several times, and he was very nice and delighted that I could include this in the talk. In Hubbard's daybooks, he mentions hiking many of these trails and locations where he camped and sketched. We will see a written sample of his daybooks later in the talk. So take a little time to look at these and just to familiarize yourself, because then when I mention a name, you will have sort of remembered a little bit. You can see that this is the view from the east, right here. And basically this is from the view, if you were in Patton, on the eastern side of Katahdin. This is from the southwestern side, if you were in the Millinocket side, looking at the mountain. It's a very different look. It's very massive. And when you look at it from the east, it opens up, and there are these incredible basins that you see. And the tallest peak, Baxter Peak, that you can see up there, that is 5,627 feet high. Here are two means of getting reference materials for a painting. Small photographs taken with a camera, documenting a composition chosen for a quick pencil drawing. Portable and convenient, especially as a viable alternative to a longer stint getting set up to work in oils. It was very nice to find this at the library, this correspondence. And over on the left is Pomola, and then you can see the gap in there. It's one of the most difficult parts of the trail before you get on the knife edge. And then the lower part of that little jaw opening is the chimney peak itself. In his book, Camping in the New England Mountains, Hubbard uses the pen and ink drawing done from this oil sketch to illustrate a story about his week in August of 1938, staying at Chimney Pond when it rained almost every day. After 5 days, the weather cleared, and he painted in the North Basin, which is what you're looking into right there. The sketch may well date from an earlier or a later trip, but the image itself sufficed for the story of a group of Boy Scouts arriving at Chimney Pond, soaked to the skin, with one of them carrying a useless pair of rubbers. Here's one of the larger illustrations in his book, done as most of these were from small oil sketches or photos made on location. Hubbard may well have used a small photograph here for the background of the knife edge. The two figures may be, as Edith Nettleton suggested, Hubbard's friends Dick Chapman and Mrs. Janice English, posing for him on the stairs leading up to his attic studio, Hobgoblin Hall. The detail provides evidence of why Hubbard was called one of the last of the old New England pen and ink masters. His background as a New York illustrator may have been influenced by the popular illustrator Arthur B. Frost, known for his illustrations of Joel Chandler Harris of the Uncle Remus stories and Mark Twain. Also, Hubbard had studied drawings of rural life in 18th and 19th century America. This style was termed shredded wheat style and was akin to steel engraving, using hatching and cross-hatching strokes to vary the tonal intensity of shadow and highlight. For comparison, here are 3 sketches, 2 in pen and ink and 1 in watercolor by the artist Cecil Palmer, who's in the book. He's in my book. Palmer, although 17 years younger than Hubbard, had camped and sketched in the Katahdin region beginning in 1925. Many of Palmer's pen and inks display a similar yet highly individual style and approach to this medium. The watercolor relates very closely to the view Hubbard painted from Basin Pond. I could probably go back. Let me see if I can go back. There's his painting this is from Basin Pond looking at the North Basin. And there you can see, that's the old Basin Pond camp before it was taken down by the Baxter State Park. It was basically in decay and needed to be torn down. But it wasn't until the 60s, I think, that they tore it down. Anyway, the watercolor relates closely to the view that Hubbard painted from the same basically location. And in the background, you can see the outlines of Hamlin Ridge, which he climbed, and the North Basin. Two artists that were painting in the region in the late 30s at the same time as Hubbard were Marston Hartley at top left, a view of Katahdin from Katahdin Lake, and Carl Springhorn at bottom right with his gestural painting of the Hunt Mountains on the east branch of the Penobscot River. Of the two, Hartley is an actual contemporary of Hubbard. Both Hartley and Springhorn, like Hubbard, worked in oils. And if you want more information on those two artists, you must take a look at my book, because there are chapters on both of them. And two other artists of note. Two other artists of note here are James Fitzgerald at top left. That painting was done from either a quick sketch or just plain memory of a plane trip he took where he and the pilot were trying to see the top of the mountain, which was encompassed in clouds. Both of these artists worked in the Katahdin region for a quarter of a century, and both worked primarily in watercolor. All four of these artists produced significant bodies of work. Although less known in Maine than these four artists, both Charles Hubbard and Cecil Palmer were selected for chapters in my book to introduce their Katahdin works to a broader audience. I might say that the picture at bottom right by Jake Day, Jake was an illustrator. He liked to play pranks on his hiking buddies, and so he did this painting called Wilderness Rescue, and it basically is about a wildlife rescue from a trip they took with snowshoes at South Branch Pond where they just simply couldn't go on and they got bogged down, so they had to have help from their wildlife friends. Here we see a larger studio work by Charles Hubbard, untitled. This oil, about 3 feet square, may very well be of the South Basin and Chimney Pond at Katahdin. And part of the reason I know that is because it's on the page in the book where he's talking about Chimney Pond. There's a little sketch of it. Note the different feel of the larger canvas and the use of brushes. Hubbard didn't title his paintings, so much of the identification of their location can be made from the texts in his book and the accompanying pen and ink drawings that he drew from the older canvases and panels themselves, many of which were unsold at his death. Marius Pellido writes in his exhibition catalog that Hubbard once told an interviewer his paintings were, quote, never of any scene in all its details. Hubbard agreed with a dictum of artist George Innes that Innes said, the duty of the artist is to paint the emotions engendered by the scene. And of Chimney Pond, Hubbard, elegantly describing this painting, wrote, in the midst of all this grandeur, close to the foot of the mighty Pomola, lies the tiny glacial lake known as Chimney Pond. Surrounded by wooded areas of spruce and fir and birch, with branches contorted into fantastic shapes by the weight of 1,000 ice storms, this forest forms an appropriate border to the pond, lying like a jewel in its gigantean granite setting. Hubbard says he has seen it, quote, when wild cloud masses came rolling across the peaks in endless ranks, swirling in and out among the pinnacles, the vast conclave depressed in gloom. Here are seen the effects of these titanic forces which have formed the world. And here we have come in admiration of this gem, this tiny offspring of the great continental ice sheet, this shrine of beauty, this mirror of God. Note the visceral quality of the palette knife work in this sketch. With the use of blunt-edged, flexible palette knives, Hubbard could sculpt his landscapes, resulting in varied textures, thick areas of impasto, akin to spreading peanut butter on bread, sweeping areas of flat color that reflect light, as well as tiny details from the knife's tip. Areas on a small panel are blocked in after an outline in charcoal or pencil is made. Colors can be mixed on the small wooden palette or mixed directly on the support. These small studies, I feel, are more expressionist in style than impressionist. The artist captures with sunlight and shadow, or the haze of distant atmosphere, the three-dimensional jagged edges of the mountain's ridges and basins set in a compressed space. As I mentioned in my book, Hubbard refrained from packing too much of the panoramic into these small panels. And it is a small panel. It's huge here. It's very impressive. But it's actually quite intimate. A sample of Hubbard's beautiful handwriting, calligraphy, taken from his day books, or common books as he called them, which he started keeping in 1917. These books help us get a clear picture of his routes up and over Katahdin, where he camped, sketched, the date, and the weather, usually just a single word, either dull, rain, or fair. And fair meant good weather. When Hubbard started to work on the main section of his book, Camping in the New England Mountains, these daybooks would have served to jog his memory of the different trips he took, which paintings he did on each, and relevant details. Observe the style of calligraphy used here. It differs from that used in his book, Camping in the New England Mountains. It's blockier and feels older in style. The artist seems to have been able to craft personal styles by blending characteristics of old and new fonts, and with such control. At top left is a small palette knife painting of the North Basin from Blueberry Knoll, which I showed you on those silhouettes. The photo of him at bottom right, posed in his outdoor best, shows him perhaps on the flanks of Katahdin with lightweight telescoping easel, panel, palette knife, and paint. Behind the camera may be Richard Chapman, a hiking companion. And I keep thinking about the little description of him that I read. Tall, thin, immaculately dressed, and with a sharp nose that preceded him by 3 inches. This photo helps further provide scale. It shows the painting kit of Kevin Shea, an artist who travels to Katahdin and paints on location, as did Hubbard. Note the small panels, the paint box, palette knife, brushes, and tubes of paint. And note the painting of Doubletop Mountain, as we shall see a subject Hubbard painted that is clipped onto a metal support in his paint box. The black and white photograph, from which this is a detail, shows Hubbard standing at Foster Field in Baxter State Park, painting the picture at top right of Doubletop Mountain and the Civilian Conservation Corps barracks at the edge of the woods. During the Depression, the CCC was created to provide jobs for the unemployed. Here in Baxter State Park, during the summers of 1934 and 35, the projects were recreational and included building the lunch ground and campsites at the foot of the Hunt Trail. a 100-foot dam on Katahdin Stream for a swimming pool. That's no longer there. And an 80-foot bridge across a gorge of Katahdin Stream, also on the Hunt Trail. That is there and has been rebuilt. A newspaper writer described the scene, quote, "Doubletop Mountain towers skyward at 3,489 feet. To the westward and on the north, the Katahdin Range rears its peaks to the clouds, the timbered lower slopes scarred by rock slides, offering a sight well worth traveling hundreds of miles to see." Not only did Hubbard see this, he recorded it for posterity. His small panel includes a piece of Baxter State Park history, the presence of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Chimney Pond was a favorite camping spot of Hubbard's, and several paintings were made there on different occasions. Alongside the three sketches is a contemporary digital photograph of the wider view there taken by the photographer William Bentley, who's one of my tech helpers and a great photographer. While writing the chapter on Mount Katahdin for his book, Hubbard remembers the famous Chimney Pond ranger, Roy Dudley, his storied fantasies of the Indian god Pomola, the warm stove inside his state cabin, and his kindness and generosity towards all visitors. Hubbard also mentions his kinship with Henry David Thoreau and his impressions of Thoreau's Katahdin narrative. Hubbard writes, and I quote, "As I wander over these lonely heights, I feel reviving within me some prehistoric ancestor, armed with flint axe and dart thrower, making his way across the plateau among herds of caribou." In his book, Camping in the New England Mountains, Hubbard writes this: "From the campground, the mountain may be ascended by way of the Hunt Trail, which forms the last, and I think, best link in the Appalachian Trail, reaching from Georgia to Maine. The trail is about 5 miles long and affords views of Witherly Ravine, the Owl, and the mountains to the north. The subject of this large studio work was recently discovered by this author to be the same as the small pen and ink on page 91 in the book, and matches the description of the view from the upper end of the Hunt Trail on Katahdin." I was thrilled to make this connection with this painting. It does help to label your paintings, but he didn't. Some artists don't. Plein air artist and rugged outdoorsman, as was Hubbard, I think, Chris Polson has here brought his art gear onto Hamlin Ridge and painted a close-up view titled "Rock Flows at the North Basin's Edge." He has managed to lug his heavy handmade box easel with a 24 by 24 inch canvas screwed securely inside to the stretcher, his gear bag with paints, medium, and brushes, etc., 9.6 miles round trip from Roaring Brook Campground to paint this almost geological abstraction. No small feat. Hubbard, like Polson, wanted to climb up high and get close in to paint rather than settle for a more distant silhouette. A vivid palette knife painting by plein air artist Chris Huntington, titled "Tiger in the Woods." This painting is of Sawtell Falls, located a few miles off the Matagamon Road on the northeast side of Katahdin. Compare this in your minds with several sketches that we have seen by Hubbard. The intensity of color, the energy of application, and the daring attempt to suggest the sounds and movement of rushing waters, all done with a palette knife, or maybe several palette knives. Huntington, now in his 70s, with a house in Patton, Maine, on the east side of Katahdin, he first painted in the Katahdin region in 1964, and is a key figure in the enduring legacy of artists at Katahdin. a modern-day interpretation of water, sky, and foliage by New Hampshire-based artist Susan Siegel. Like musical notes, her bright palette of colors suggests a windy day at Bell Pond in Baxter State Park. I painted this canvas myself while on snowshoes on a cold morning at the Katahdin Lake Wilderness Camps. I was there with Chris Huntington for 13 days in March of 2007. The painting session lasted 3 hours and was almost dry several days later when I was driven out to my van by snowmobile and with a tow sled. And notice in this painting, I took a little bit of artistic license and added in smoke coming out of the metal chimney. There was no one in residence. Returning to Hubbard at last, you can see my setup. Almost looks like the table in the back. In the Edith B. Nettleton Historical Room at the Guilford Free Library. On a table are placed 3 of the 12 by 16-inch oil sketches, 3 of the master sheets from Hubbard's hand-drawn and written book, a few of the small drawings and photos he used for his trips as reference material, and 4 of my layout sheets with Hubbard imagery that would be used in my book, Art of Katahdin. I brought those with me today. They're over on with the show and tell. To conclude, here is the cover of my new book, Art of Katahdin, which I hope you will have a chance to look through. On the cover is a gouache painting by Judy Taylor titled Spring Comes to Katahdin. Compared with his writings, photography, and paintings done about life in Connecticut, and especially the town of Guilford, Hubbard's work at Katahdin plays a much smaller part, while his work at the Goodwill School, and by extension his work in many locations in Maine, plays a significant part in his life's work. Although Marius Pellido in his essay deems Hubbard a second-rank American impressionist when compared with the likes of Childe Hassam, John Twachtman, who he studied with, and Willard Metcalf, and others, I think Hubbard's Katahdin paintings place him in 2 other realms, both unusual and contemporary. A romantic in the larger canvases, and an expressionist in the challenging, smaller plein air sketches. In Hubbard's obituary, the writer said, quote, "All through the years, Mr. Hubbard had done distinguished paintings in oil, reflecting not only keen sensitivity, but the vigor and artistic integrity which were part and parcel of the man." I concur with that. The sense I get reading Camping in the New England Mountains is how deeply he loved nature's flora and fauna, being out of doors, high up in the mountains, hiking the trails, camping under the stars, observing and celebrating God's mysteries, perhaps even more than painting. Hubbard said, "For myself, I like to take plenty of time. Feeling the ascent of a mountain is too wonderful an experience to be passed over hurriedly." Thank you very much. If anyone has a question, please ask away. I'll try to do my best.
My question is, we have been up to the Bates Museum, and I saw the rondelle, and then there were other plaques up there on the wall that I presume maybe high school students did. Down here in Guilford, the senior class has a tradition of making plaques and building them and painting them themselves, what was important to their class. They're extremely similar.
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
I don't know too much about that, but it's very possible that inspired. I know when I went to school in New York City, that we had to create a piece every year, not every year, but each one of us had to have one craft piece that went up on the wall at the school that would remain there forever, and it could be any subject you wanted. So it could be that there are these traditions that go on. I don't know really about the students at Goodwill in Fairfield.
I just went on the museum director to the downtown tavern,
Yeah?
and that's where these are that she's talking about. They're, the class shields that the kids in the class do, and he was the art teacher at the high school who got that program started.
Uh-huh.
So it was Charles Hubbard initiative.
That actually answers part of my question. Did he teach?
Oh, yes, he taught for 50 years. He taught in East Haven, and he taught at, I can't remember the name of it, one of the, in the commercial high school. And he did taught, and he taught Carl Balistraci, who's maybe here.
No.
No, didn't come. You had a question?
I did, I wondered if you could identify this one.
In one of the paintings.
Yes, if you look in the book,
Yeah, I was there.
I'm pretty sure that this one is in the chapter where he's talking about the White Mountains.
The White Mountain.
Oh yeah, he hiked and camped there too. He loved it there. There's a whole nother chapters. There's only 2 chapters on Katahdin at the end. The rest of it is all recollections of these different trips. But he has those 2 figures in one of the pen and inks. So where is the painting?
In my living room.
Oh, you lucky.
It's big, it's
Yeah.
yay by yo. So those, you couldn't identify the children or the people then either?
Well, he hired models to pose for him, and from what I read in one of the texts, they were, basically he would pose them in his studio or on the stairs going up if they were seated. Or if he wanted one standing and one seated, he would do that and then do basically a drawing from that and put the background in behind it. Oh yeah, oh yeah. There's also a section on Tumbledown Mountain in Maine. He has one story that he tells about a party of 3, I think, that come up and they climb Mount Washington, and they get to a point where they decide to go from this place that's midway up to try and get to the top, and they're advised not to because of the weather changing, and they go anyway, and one of them dies on that trip. And so Hubbard was there at that time. Any other questions? I will say one thing. This book was a long-term project. It was a long time in coming. It basically started out as a realization that I had more than enough materials for this book. And there's never been a book about the artists who have been inspired by Maine's greatest treasure, Mount Katahdin, the biggest object in the state. And I had been collecting materials for a number of years, and between my antique postcards and my articles and first edition books and books that are not first edition, just stuff that I started to collect, I began to really put together that there was a tradition at Katahdin and that I could probably do this. And my whole life I've been an artist, basically, painting landscapes outdoors. So I had to do it. There was a big learning curve, and I had to kind of do a lot of stuff from scratch and learn about each one of these artists and things like that. Anyway, I'm really delighted that the book has been so well received, and I also am very, very happy to have included Charles Hubbard in the book. I have a great deal of respect for his work. I wish I could buy one of those back there, have it on my wall. Thank you all for coming.
Books are available for sale here, and I just want to remind you that Hubbard's paintings are hung in the reading room and the historical room upstairs. If you haven't seen them lately, you might want to have a look.
My best friend has a very good-sized canvas that Charles Hubbard painted of her uncle. He's kneeling before a campfire, flipping a flapjack with the rocks, the mountain in the background.
This one, I think there's one in the book.
Yeah?
There's one here of him flipping a pancake too. I think it's actually the first image. You may have the painting of this. They may have the painting of this piece.
This is her Uncle Walter, my friend's Uncle Walter Beckwith.
And this book, I think if you call the museum in Maine, the Elsie Bates Museum, you can still purchase copies of this book. I don't know how many there are, but I think you can.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
You know, those pictures are quite close, like